Hello friends, so today's video is going to be about some books that have a more unconventional approach when it comes to the way in which they tell a story. So a couple years ago at this point, I did a few videos where I asked you your most loved and your most hated tropes, and then I went through and I found books that contained those, and I kind of sort of checked how often do we actually seem to really hate that trope. When a book contains, let's say, a love triangle, how often does the average rating really show how much we supposedly dislike that? And then I ranked where we voted on for the tropes, and then I put the average rating for books that contain those tropes and compared and contrasted it. Anyway, I'll have that video linked if this is something that you find interesting. But what I wanted to do today is somewhat similar. I wanted to go through some books that do not tell a story in the typical way. They take some chances and they're very unique. And I wanted to see how often we actually appreciate that. So I'm going to go through these various different books, give you a little insight as to what makes them unique, and then also check the average rating. The first book that I'm going to start out with would be The Bone Shard Daughter. And this one, I would say, is sneaky with its unconventional approach to storytelling, because the thing that makes it unique is that our two main perspectives are in first person, and then our side characters have third person points of view. And what's also really interesting about this is that I didn't really even notice it at first. It took a while before I was like, wait, is this book is it in first person? Yeah. But then I'd get to the next part, I'm like, wait, this is in third person. And then finally I realized that it was just different depending on the character. But the author, I think, utilizes these different perspectives really in a very clever way, because the perspectives that are in third person, I would argue, we're looking more at the themes that are being represented, or maybe what is going on in the area around those characters, more so than the characters themselves. Not that the characters aren't important, but they are secondary characters, and so the priority is not only given to what is surrounding them and the story that is the plot, I would say. It's more like plot driven with them. And then it also helps put at the forefront our two main characters. It's not the only book to ever do this. One of my absolute favorite examples of this is found in the Bartimaeus trilogy. So this is a middle grade / YA series that follows a boy who summons a djinn. And in this one, the djinn has the first person perspective, but on top of that, they have the ability to have multiple thoughts at once. But of course, you can't really articulate that via writing, and so there's footnotes where whenever he has multiple thoughts at the same time, that is how he is able to let you know about the other thoughts he's having. And I love this series. I used to think that was kind of like, I don't know if I'm gonna like this, there's all these footnotes, but I ended up really liking the footnotes. You see footnotes in Ruin of Kings. You also see footnotes in Nevernight. So we'll go into the average ratings for all of those. Nevernight, I would say it's mostly the footnotes that make it unique. And then Ruin of Kings is, you know, those stories that are like, I'm gonna tell you my life story. Ruin of Kings, like, I'm going to tell you my life story. No, I'm going to tell you your life story. Oh, also there's footnotes to interject. So that one's also very, very unique. So we're going to look at the average ratings of all of these and see how much we appreciate playing around with perspectives and playing around with footnotes. Okay, starting with The Bone Shard Daughter. This better be high. This book is good. 4.09. That's pretty good. I would prefer it higher because it's great and I think it deserves to be much better. But that is not, that's nothing to be upset about. 4.09 is pretty great, especially because I think it's a debut also. So I'll take it. Obviously there's other reasons to rate this book high or low, of course, right? It's not like that's the only thing people are rating, but when it had something unique, it would seem, ruin the experience for most people. The first book in the Bartimaeus trilogy has 3.99 for its average rating. It does have a lot of ratings, 127,000 over that amount. So good for both of those. They both have great ratings. Let's look at, I'm pretty sure Nevernight does have a pretty decent rating. Nevernight, I think, has been made fun of a lot on BookTube. And also it has a very loyal fan base. The fans of that story really love it, but it's not for everyone. But I don't think the footnotes affect too much, but let's still see. Okay, 4.20. That's higher than the previous two. I'm not here to try and imply that any book is objectively better. I just happen to really love the Bone Shard daughter. So, it's upsetting a little bit. Ruin of Kings has 3.8. And this one, I would say, it most heavily impacted the story. Out of these first 4 books that I've mentioned, I would say the footnotes and the fact that you have 2 different characters detailing past events for one character, but at different times in that character's life, that's a lot. That's a lot to ask of the reader, especially because it's a pretty... there's a lot to that fantasy world, so there's a lot to take in on top of the interesting approach. Next up, we have the Witcher series by Andrzej Sapkowski. This is interesting because it starts with 2 collections of short stories, and then it gets into the main series, which is a very unusual way to start a series. And on top of that, the very first book, The Last Wish, it is not told in chronological order. And it's not just I'm going to tell you my life story, so you go to the past. And I wouldn't even call it, it's kind of a fractured timeline, but I wouldn't even so much categorize it as that. It's more, I would say, the way that the themes within one story kind of tie into what's happening, and then it sort of weaves its way into a different story. So I think there's a purpose in it, but I think it's not as simple as, then we're getting this point in time, and then this point in time. And you have present day, and then you go into one of the short stories, then you go back to present day, and then you go into the short story, and you kind of go back and forth. So not the easiest way to start a series, kind of confusing for some people. Really interesting choice for Netflix to decide they were going to try to stay true to the book and try to also tell it with that in mind. But either way, unique. I don't see a ton of series that are like that. Okay, so looking at The Last Wish, our average rating is 4.12. That's higher than I would expect. It has 242,000 ratings. I expected a lot of ratings because, of course, there's the video game and now there's the Netflix show. So there's a lot that's going to get people interested in the book. That's a lot of ratings. And I'm surprised it's that high. I gotta say, I'm surprised it's as high as it is, given that it is so different. Next up, we have Chaos Walking. So there's a couple things that make this interesting. The setup for the story is that we follow a boy who lives in a society that is only made up of men. Something has happened to all the women. You don't really know what. Our main character doesn't know what. He thinks he knows. And then part of the story is finding out what actually happened. And then also going on the run as he's starting to discover more of the truth. So this main character is illiterate. And the author has that reflected in the story by having things misspelled. And it's not hard to figure out what he's actually thinking or saying, but it still takes some getting used to have all these misspelled words. And then on top of that, all of the men's thoughts are projected, basically, and it's called noise. And so you hear the noise, you hear the noise in the story by, let me find an example. Here's a perfect example. You'll get kind of this chaotic mess of words, and that's sort of representing all of the noise that's happening, which would be all of the men's thoughts being projected out. I think that ultimately people really respect this, but I have seen some negative reviews of it that could not get past those two things. Anywho, 3.96. That's kind of what I thought. It has over 181,000, it's almost at 182,000 ratings at this point. Next up, we have Vicious by V.E. Schwab. The thing that makes this unique is its fractured timeline. It's one of my favorite things about this story, actually. And I personally think that the fractured timeline elevates the suspense of this story. I think it puts you very much on the edge of your seat. And I also think that she teases you with information and it keeps you wanting to turn the page because you want to get more. And you get more, but then you want more after that. The story follows two young men who in present day hate each other, want to kill each other, and back in the past they used to be best of pals. And so you're like, what happened? But they want to destroy each other, and you're like, why? And so you want to know. You don't want to just know why their friendship is over, but you want to know why they want to kill each other now. And there's also some interesting aspects to what I'm just going to go ahead and call the magic system in this story. I don't want to say too much because I think part of the fun of this book is discovering more about it. It is very dark, it is very twisted, but so much of your curiosity is going to be increased the more you read, I think. And the more you get, it's like, the best way I can describe it is when you're watching a movie or you're playing a video game and there's a countdown and that clock is just slowly, you see it going down and it's getting louder and louder and your suspense is building and building. I feel like that's what this ends up creating. It creates that feeling, and I loved that. The average rating for Vicious is very high. It is 4.20, has over 141,000 ratings. That's really high. I wasn't expecting that many ratings. The last book I'm going to mention, and I absolutely had to in this video, would be the Illuminae files, because these are so not told in your original traditional way. So they take advantage of surveillance footage, and it describes to you what you would see on the surveillance footage, or it has messages back and forth between characters, or it has a list of casualties or something along those lines, right? It's never just a direct, here's what's going on with these characters. So the average rating is 4.24. It's very high. And I remember so many people picking this up and loving it. But I also wanted to ask, when hearing about these less conventional means of telling stories, do you find yourself typically thinking, that's interesting, I want to read that? Or are you someone who's like, I mean, it sounds like a little much, and then it makes you not want to read it? For me, if the literal writing on the page is affected, I think I tend to be like, I don't know. And then when it's more so how you utilize already established things and then mix it up, then I'm like, okay, all right. Like the playing around with having different points of view, which is kind of on the lower end of being unconventional. It's not that unique. But then Illuminae, for the longest time, I was like, I don't think I want to read that. Would you say that you agree with the average ratings that you've seen for these books? And how often do you think the average ratings were affected by the unique factor of these various different books? But anyway, if I have book reviews for any of these, I'll have them linked down below. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.